Good afternoon and welcome to the IMechE's webinar on medical device regulation in a post-Brexit world. I'm Helen Mees, I'm your host for today, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Institution's Biomedical Engineering Division. Before we begin, I just want to introduce our guest speaker. I've known Phil Brown for a number of years now in his role as Director of Regulatory and Compliance at the Association of British HealthTech Industries. But Phil has a long career in the medtech and pharma sector, beginning with his career in Smith & Nephew as a graduate in, I dare say, 1984, before moving into the company's wound care regulatory affairs team at that time when the Medical Device Directive was first being enacted. Phil has worked for a number of major businesses in health tech, and over the years he has developed his expertise at strategic management level, liaising with national authorities, the European Commission and trade associations, and helped to develop a number of standards on issues related to regulation and ethics. Phil joined the ABHI in June 2016 as Director responsible for regulatory and compliance matters. And as part of his current duties, Phil chairs the BSA Standards Working Group, which covers quality and risk standardisation. He's a Fellow of TORPA and lectures at Sheffield Hallam University on medical device regulatory frameworks. So he knows a thing or two about this subject. I really do hope you're going to enjoy the presentation today, and I look forward to the Q&A afterwards. Enjoy the presentation.
Good afternoon, and it's a real pleasure to be with you at the Institute of Mechanical Engineers. First of all, thank you very much for the opportunity to actually give you a little bit of information on the regulations that relate to medical technologies. My name's Phil Brown. I'm the Director of Regulatory and Compliance at the Association of British HealthTech Industries. So let's get cracking with my first slide. I guess the first question to ask, or the first question you're likely to want to know, is who we are. Who are ABHI? Well, we are actually what we consider the leading health technology industry association in the UK. There are a number of others, but we have a community of around 300 members, just over 300 members. But those 300 members represent around 80% of the NHS spend. So you can imagine we actually look after quite a lot of the larger corporate companies and also a number of SME companies. And this slide just typically gives you an idea of what trade associations do. We help industry by providing a collective voice. We give that support through our mediations with government and industry, other bodies, and we facilitate that collaboration with businesses that allow them to actually flourish in the UK. The next slide is a little bit of a breakdown of our membership. As I say, we have around 300 members. It roughly equates to the health tech industry geography in the UK, in that we have a predominance of SMEs, around 89%, as you can see on this particular pie chart. In fact, in the UK, there are around 3,500 medtech companies, which represents probably around 95% SMEs. So you can see that there's quite a vibrant small company and innovation hub within the UK. And ABHI's membership manufactures and develops products, everything from implants right the way through to single-use products, capital equipment, right the way through to now diagnostics, digital and robot-assisted surgeries. So my job today really is to give you a little bit of an overview of the medical devices regulations and some of the changes which are being included within the new medical device regulation itself. As you know, as you probably know, the Medical Device Directive is our old piece of kit, if you like, which was developed back in 1993 and is going through a transition period with the medical device regulation as it is at the moment. So that medical device regulation will come into full force on the 27th of May of this year. The principles of the new approach covers both the Medical Device Directive and the Medical Device Regulation. And it's interesting and I think and important to go through what those principles are before we start talking about what the differences are, just in case there are people on the line who are not quite as familiar with the regulations as others. So we'll talk a little bit later on about the liabilities and the differences between medical devices and pharmaceuticals, but the new approach consists of a number of articles and principles. First of all, every product has to meet a set of what's called essential requirements, or in the new regulation, general safety and performance requirements. As you saw from that previous slide, medical devices covers everything from sticking plasters through to CAT scanners. So there is a process within the new approach for defining products according to classification and risk. There's then a process of conformity assessment, which is the process which is used for actually doing reviews, audits of both manufacturing and of technical files, technical information that pertains to a product. Both the device directive and the device regulation include the use of standards within the conformity assessment process, and we'll talk about standards in a little bit more detail. And of course, every product will have a technical file. And again, we'll go through what a technical file contains so that you will have that information at hand. I'm also going to touch on the different roles between the competent authorities and the notified bodies. And of course, then to really hone in on this principle of declaration of conformity, which is the fundamental difference between the medtech industry and the pharmaceutical legislation. So, how is the MDR changing then? If we're actually moving from the Medical Device Directive to the Medical Device Regulation, what is actually changing? One of the things which I always try to include within my presentations is this very, very first point, and that is that the regulation is moving the industry much more to a business-related process, or the regulation to a much more business-related process. The Medical Device Directive was very product focused, and sometimes unfairly the regulatory affairs teams had the tag of being the sales prevention team. That's no longer the case, and in fact the regulation includes huge swathes of quality management requirements as well as post-marketing requirements and clinical requirements. So in fact it's my belief that the regulation is much more holistic and in fact is now much more of a business process than perhaps a product-specific process. The new regulation is really building on the articles within the directive which relate to pre- and post-marketing requirements, how we deal with products once they actually get onto the market. So the regulations are not just applying a CE mark, it's how to maintain your product once it actually gets there, gets onto the market. But there are similarities with the Medical Device Directive. So if you're familiar with the Medical Device Directive, which is based again on risk and conformity assessment, you're going to know the basic principles of the Medical Device Regulation. In both instances, you are satisfying, as we've previously mentioning, a set of essential requirements or general safety and performance requirements, and that's for every single product. And of course, every product will have a technical file generated for it. The regulation still has both MHRA and notified body interactions, and we'll talk about what those different interactions are in a moment. The Medical Device Regulation has a significant increase in technical requirements, particularly as it relates to clinical performance. and the use of things like substantial equivalence or equivalence claims within your demonstration of that clinical performance. In addition, there are a number of classification changes where, in fact, the new regulation is up-classifying some products, particularly those which are currently Class 1 products and self-declared, and now becoming reusable products. So here we have things like surgical instruments and the like, which may now actually have notified body interactions for the first time. There are, in fact, a number of additional products which are coming under the scope of the new regulations. Things which you would probably have thought were already included, but things like contact lenses, coloured contact lenses. Coloured contact lenses are those which change the colour of the iris or make the appearance of changing the colour of the iris. Technology is very similar to contact lenses, so there's no reason why they shouldn't be covered under the same regulation. Under the device directive, they were not covered because they didn't have that effect of changing or modifying the physiological function of being able to see. So what's the difference between competent authorities and notified bodies? You've probably heard of these in the past, and it's the same for the regulation as it is for the directive. So competent authorities, clearly there is one per member state. Here in the UK, we of course work with the MHRA, the Medicines and Health Products Regulatory Agency. And these competent authorities deal with aspects of registration. There are going to be some changes as we leave Europe. I'm not intending to go through anything to do with Brexit at the moment, but keep an eye out for changes in registration requirements. But the registration requirements are such that you need to include Class 1 products particularly, but also procedure packs onto a registration database so that the MHRA can keep tabs on all of the products which are being placed on the UK market. The MHRA are also involved in approval of clinical investigations. Those products which don't yet have a CE mark because they cannot conform to all of the essential principles or the general safety and performance requirements, but in fact want to go into humans through clinical investigations. So the MHRA gets involved in that process. And also they get involved in vigilance issues. So if you have a failure of a product or a device has some performance issues which go through the vigilance databases, then the competent authorities will actually be part of that assessment. Notified bodies, however, are the bodies which are mandated by the competent authorities to undertake activities such as conformity assessment and technical reviews. The competent authority clearly doesn't have the manpower to cover all of those products we had on that previous slide. So they mandate to notified bodies who have expertise in those particular areas to deal with conformity assessment, manufacturing, quality management systems, as well as the technical data that relate to the quality, safety and performance of those products as part of audit programs. Now, being commercial organisations, you as the manufacturer can choose which notified body to use, and that is normally determined by the scope of that notified body. Not all notified bodies have a complete scope, so working from wheelchairs through to CAT scanners. Some specialise in electrical and electromedical products. And in those instances, you would choose a notified body which has that particular product range within their scope. But you, as the manufacturer, have the ability to choose which notified body you particularly want to work with. Under the Medical Device Directive, there were around 55 to 58 notified bodies. But that number is greatly reduced as we move to the regulations, and a lot of notified bodies are currently going through a designation process to be able to act as notified bodies within this new scheme. Currently there are around 10 notified bodies, I believe, which cover the medical device regulation implementation. So what about the different liabilities between medical devices and pharmaceutical regulation? The big important aspect in this is this very first line here. If you can think of your aspirin tablets that you have perhaps in your desk at work or wherever, you'll notice that it has a product license on it, a product license number. And that product license is granted after review by essentially government agencies or the European Medicines Agency to ensure that that drug product is of good quality, that it's safe and it's efficacious. After that, at that review by those government bodies, you get your product license number and you can affix it to your product and place that product on the market. With medical devices, that liability lies predominantly or only with the manufacturer. It's you as the manufacturer who decides when you have the appropriate level of data to cover quality, safety and performance of your device. And at that point, you have to sign a legal document called a Declaration of Conformity. And it is that Declaration of Conformity which you hold as the manufacturer that allows you to place the CE mark on the product and therefore place on the market. So in many ways, the device manufacturer's interactions with the competent authorities and the notified bodies is key, because what you're actually doing in that process is to ensure as you're generating your technical data that you're generating it in a way which is in compliance with the regulations and therefore that you can legally draw up your Declaration of Conformity. We've already mentioned that as part of that process you will be completing a technical file which demonstrates that compliance, and that you will be working towards a quality management system to control the manufacture of that and the systems involved with generating that data. Quality management systems have now formed part of the regulation. So unlike with the Medical Device Directive, where you were using mandated or harmonized standards to work with your quality management system, it's now a legal requirement because that will become part of the legislation. So as I say, product liability lies solely with you as the manufacturer, and so you have quite a lot of flexibility in the way that you demonstrate your regulatory compliance. So what do you need to do in order to apply your CE mark? It sounds quite straightforward and easy listening to those previous slides. You have the ability to decide when you have sufficient data and so on and so on. But the first thing you have to do when you sign that legal Declaration of Conformity is to say that you're in compliance with the regulation. And that, of course, implies a number of different things. First of all, it means that you are in compliance with all of the relevant general safety and performance requirements. Now, those are found in Annex 1 of both the Medical Device Directive and the Medical Device Regulation, so very straightforward and easy to find. In the Medical Device Regulation, as you can see, there are a number of additional GSPRs over those which were in the essential requirements within the Medical Device Directive. And they're divided into three basic lumps. The first is a general requirement section, which really covers things like quality management and risk mitigation. You then have sections which cover design and manufacture, and there are a number of things in there which include chemical, physical and biological properties of your product, as well as how you've designed and reached that final product stage. And then also in the last piece, Chapter 3, the information that you then supply to the end user by way of labelling and instructions for use. So that's the essential requirements. What you then have to do is to consider classification and risk. Now, classification is a really interesting and really important part of the regulation itself and is in Annex 8. Annex 8 provides practically a decision tree where you can decide which classification your product actually falls within. whether it falls within a very low risk, a class 1, or whether it goes through into a class 2A or a 2B or a class 3 product. And depending on which classification you have for your product depends on the interactions that you will have with either the competent authorities or the notified bodies. Now that classification is determined again by you as the manufacturer, but it can actually be challenged by the notified body. So it's incumbent on you to make sure you follow those classification rules correctly. You'll notice as well that those classifications are actually split down even further. So you have class 1 sterile, class 1 reusable, and class 1 measurable. And it's the class 1 reusable which is new to the medical device regulation. In those instances, the notified body will need to get involved with your company on the sterility, on the reusable aspects, and the measuring functions within your devices. They won't want to look at anything else other than how you sterilize your product, how many times it can be reused, and what the measuring function and how you've validated that measuring function to be correct. Now, risk is managed by another one of these harmonized standards. And this is one of those important numbers which, if you remember any number of standards, this is the one that you should remember, which is EN ISO 14971, currently as 2012, I think, or I think it may even be 2016 now. I apologise if that's wrong. But the risk standard actually then gives you another decision tree in how to determine the risk of your product and how to manage risk within your product, not only before you place your CE mark on that product, but how you then manage risk after you've placed the product onto the market. Risk management is very much an iterative process and is one of those processes which you never let the ink go dry on. So you're always revisiting risk in order to adjust, update, or to perform tweaks on your product to make them safer than they were when you first looked at your risk management, for example. If you want to look for a list of those harmonized standards, there's a web link there, so you can actually look for which standards might apply to your product. There are a number of harmonized standards which will help you in that process. The use of standards such as these are a route to demonstrating compliance. So when a notified body notices that you're using a specific standard for your product, the notified body is then happy that you're following the appropriate methods, and therefore the data that you're producing is appropriate for CE marking. The whole question of harmonisation is in debate at the moment, simply because the regulation is still needing a bunch of harmonised or standards to be harmonised against the regulation itself. So if you are in that process of looking for standards, keep going back to that, because the number of harmonised standards will increase as time goes on. So risk is constantly challenged and updated as a result of your product knowledge and patient exposure. There's clearly links with your product design and development, because as you increase that product knowledge and patient exposure, you might want to tweak the design or change the product in some way. And you're always, as part of that use of risk, evaluating the risk and benefit dynamic. Always look out though and think for any changes which might be occurring to classification. As we mentioned, there's those bunch of reusable products now which are being covered by notified bodies. So classification changes do occur. There was one, for example, that was involved with back in 2010, I think it was, where total joint replacements were actually up classified, which means a whole new bunch of data to be produced, a whole new bunch of risk management files to prepare. But one thing that risk management through 14971 does allow you to do is to think about your life cycle analysis. how you develop, introduce, make redundant your products, how you introduce and develop your products or whatever. So it's a really good tool to enable you to do that. What about conformity assessment? Well, conformity assessment is done through another one of these harmonised standards, which is 13485. And again, it's one of those numbers like 14971 that you should have in your memory. Quality management, as we've mentioned before, is really now part of the regulation, which is making it that business, giving it that business focus. Now, there are a number of options as to how you will carry out conformity assessment, and there are different annexes in the regulation which discuss and describe how you would use these different routes to compliance. But basically, you can look at how you would use those particular annexes. If, for example, you're doing a mass production of products, if you're doing hundreds of thousands or even thousands of products every year, you might want to use a type examination type process. Or if you're just manufacturing one or two pieces of capital equipment every year, you might want to use your product conformity verification routes. So there are a number of different ways that you can skin a cat. I really shouldn't use that term as I've got two of my own, but you know, the flexibility within the regulation allows you to think about how to work with quality management to control your product in an appropriate way. In that instance, what you've done, and once you've actually defined what your quality management system is, and once it's actually been looked at and audited by your notified body, the notified body will issue with a certificate, and that will relate only to your quality management system. You will then have to do all of the other technical annexes which deal with control of your product. So let's quickly go through some of the classifications that we were talking about earlier on. So Class 1 products, again, how do we apply that CE mark? Because these products, Class 1s, are very low risk, you can think of things like wheelchairs or non-sterile tongue depressors or kidney bowls, those sorts of things. They will be self-declared, and it will be you as the manufacturer who determines when you have sufficient data to place your product on the market. There will be no real notified body input unless you have one of these sterilizing, measuring or reusable functions, but you would still have to think about quality management systems. Again, you will be having to demonstrate compliance through that declaration of conformity that you're in compliance with the regulation, which infers a quality management system. But in these instances, you might not necessarily need to progress onto a full-blown 13485 system. There are a number of companies that might use a lesser process, such as ISO 9000, just as an example, although that is quite rare, I must say. But it's up to you, as I say, as the manufacturer, to draw up that declaration of conformity once you're happy that you've satisfied those general safety and performance requirements. The greater the classification, the more notified body input you will have. So here you will have, as you go through 2A, 2B and 3, you will have notified bodies looking at your technical files and your conformity assessment processes. The increased risk that there is inherent within those products mean that there will be an increased demand in the sophistication as to how you're demonstrating clinical performance. With Class 3 products, for example, it's almost implied within the regulation that you'll be conducting clinical investigations and that clinical evaluations are not the appropriate way to demonstrate that performance. And indeed, once you get to novel Class 3 products, you will have to go through what's called a scrutiny procedure, which is where the competent authorities or the commission will be actually assessing the work done by notified bodies to make sure that that notified body has allowed or audited those technical files and your quality management systems appropriately. Now, your technical file content we're going to come on to, but is included within Annex 2. And I've just outlined on this particular slide what that technical file would look like. So you'll have a description of your device, the specifications that you use to control it, the information that you're providing, i.e. your labeling or your instructions for use. You will also be including details of how you designed your product, how you're manufacturing it, what processes you used in your manufacturing facility to control your product, how you've demonstrated compliance to your general safety and performance requirements, how you've balanced risk and benefit, and how you're dealing with risk management and integrating that into things like your post-marketing surveillance processes, how you've achieved verification of your product, and how you validate that the manufacturing processes are consistently making that product. And then again, importantly, one of the big drives within the MDR is how you then demonstrate compliance against both preclinical and clinical data, safety and performance. And then there may be other additional information that you may want to include within your technical file. For example, how you're dealing with predicate devices, whether you're actually looking at your clinical evaluations, where you're getting your data from, that sort of level of information. Penultimate slide. So, why is it considered a business regulation? Up until now, as I've mentioned, we've talked about the Medical Device Directive being very product focused. It actually had no more than about 45-50 pages to cover all of those pieces of medical device technology. Quite an elegant piece of legislation. However, the medical device regulation is many more pages than that. It's almost up to around 200 pages, I believe. So there's a lot more requirement within the compliance processes. But signing that declaration of conformity, as it says on this slide, is just the beginning, and why it's actually more of a business process. You're constantly and continuously updating both your quality, clinical and risk assessments based on your post-marketing surveillance activities. So everything that you're getting back from the market through your marketeers, through your sales teams, through your quality teams, through all of those people, including your surgeons who use your product, maybe even patients who have been impacted by products. You should be collecting all of that information as post-market surveillance and inputting that into risk so that you're constantly updating all of those documents. Vigilance, although it's a separate point on this slide, is only one part of post-market surveillance. Do not think that post-market surveillance is restricted to just sitting there picking up the phone in case something goes wrong with your product once it's actually been applied to a patient. It's far from it. You have to plan how you're going to gain all of your post-market surveillance work, how you're going to introduce that, and the notified body is going to want to be able to see evidence of how you're introducing that into your business process. You're also now, with the regulation through the introduction of databases such as UDAMED, making some of this safety and clinical data publicly available. So if you're going to be generating clinical information, please be aware that some of that data as summaries or summary reports on clinical information will be published and will be available for people like me to scrutinise when I go and have one of my knees replaced, which won't be too far off, I suspect. But the regulation, interestingly, from a legal perspective, includes a lot of those elements within the text of the regulation itself. Unlike the directive, where a lot of those things were actually covered by standards, they're now part of the regulation itself. And because the regulation will be directly applicable within law, it becomes a legal requirement for you to do post-market surveillance, clinical work, and quality assessments, all of those sorts of things. So it's really important, that last point. Never let the ink go dry on any of the work that you're carrying out against the medical device regulation. it was a wise man who said to me to document the hell out of everything, because the notified body is sure going to find non-conformities or areas where you could have improvement within your technical information and so on. So never let that ink run dry, and always consider how the state of the art is changing within that particular product fit. So if you're working with software, think about how the state of the art is working, for example, on things like cyber security, those sorts of things. So it's very much more a business regulation. So although the legal liability for placing that product in the market lies with you as the manufacturer, it includes everything that you do within your business process. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is just about my time up, and I think is all I need to go through today. I'm more than happy to take questions. I appreciate that there's a lot of information on these slides, and I'm sure that the Institute will make them available to you. So please feel free to ask them. I know we've got a Q&A session now, but my contact details are on this last slide if you wish to talk more about how you regulate your products, what the differences are with the MDR, or maybe even how Brexit is going to affect that. So at this point, I'd like to say thank you very much and invite questions.
Bill, thank you ever so much for that presentation. That was excellent. It's really been very helpful to me to get a really good view of what's going on at the moment and what we're going to be leading towards in the next few years. Just before we start taking a few questions from people who are attending, I just wanted to ask really, could you expand on why you talked about the new regulations being more business focused, and what does that mean in practical terms?
Yeah, good question. The importance, or the important document that has to be signed at the end of all of this process to enable you to place your product on the market is that declaration of conformity. And in my mind, for sure, because the regulation now includes so many of those different elements of PMS and product development and clinical evaluation and investigation and continual management of your risk, and the fact that it involves so many different stakeholders within that process means to me that as the general manager or whoever it is that's signing that declaration of conformity and allowing, if you like, that legal placing on the market, he has to know, or she has to know, exactly what's going on with the product and how it's changing, how it's being managed, all sorts of things. So it's not really just a case of putting together a technical file and giving it to your marketeers and saying, here you go, have fun with this and hope you sell lots of product and all sorts of stuff like that. It's much more encompassing now. And the fact that a lot of that stuff has been included within the legal text of the regulation rather than just relying on standards means that there is much more of a legal responsibility on that signature. So don't underestimate the significance of that signature.
That's really useful to know. I mean, it is very easy, I guess, as well as from an engineering point of view, to be very focused just on the product, but not necessarily thinking about the wider holistic business side of things.
Absolutely, and particularly if you've got self-declared products or Class 2A products where you're dealing with what is essentially fairly low risk things, you might think, well, okay, I'll just stick a signature on the bottom of this piece of paper. But legally now, because of those inclusions within the MDR, it means there'll be so much comeback from either the competent authorities or from anybody challenging you for that sale.
Yeah, well, it kind of leads on to a question we've had from Dominic actually. He's asked, what do manufacturers need to know about clinical evaluation under the MDR during product development through to the launch stage? And I think that's a very important question for engineers, particularly.
Yeah, and in fact, the thanks for that question, Dominic. In fact, the clinical side of the regulation has really been ramped up in comparison with the directive. In fact, there are two things that you've got to try and separate out in your mind. The difference between clinical evaluation and clinical investigation. So, in a sense, the actual requirements have not changed significantly between directive and regulation, in that there are essentially three ways that you would demonstrate clinical performance. That is by doing a clinical evaluation, which means that you would just do a scan of all of the products which are currently on the market, which are similar to yours, looking at how they're performing, how yours performs in comparison with that, whether or not you are actually developing a product which is going to work the way that you expect it to, and the way that you are going to describe how it works within your instructions for use and all of that sort of stuff. That's what an evaluation is. But then when you move towards investigations, you are actually looking specifically at how your product is performing in specific populations. And that's where you would do a clinical investigation. So you might, for a hip implant, actually do a clinical investigation to make sure that high-risk product will actually work as you intend it to. So you can actually use clinical evaluations or clinical investigations to demonstrate that performance, and then you could use a grey area in the middle where you would use a combination of both. But the regulation now is making it much more difficult on two aspects. First of all, as I said, I think in the slides, there is the implication, or there's actually a requirement within the regulation itself, that if you've got high-risk products, Class 3s, maybe in some of the Class 2s, you're expected to do clinical investigations. So no longer are you allowed to say, well, my hip implant is going to be similar to one which is already on the market, therefore I know that it's going to work, so I just need to do a clinical evaluation. For high-risk products, very much more directed towards clinical investigations. And the other really important thing to point out is that the regulation now is really restricting how you as a manufacturer can use things like comparisons. So if you have a product which is very similar to another one which is made down the road by a competitor company, you can no longer really say, well, my product is exactly the same as theirs, therefore I don't need to do too much other than a clinical evaluation. And particularly for those high-risk products, you wouldn't be allowed to do that. In essence, the regulation says that you have to be able to demonstrate that clinical equivalence exists. So you would need to go to that competitor company and say, right, I want to claim equivalence to your product. Can you let me have your technical file in order for me to check that is in fact the case? And how many competitor companies are going to allow their technical files out the door to a competitor? Just won't work. So that sort of clinical comparisons is becoming a lot more controlled, and it means that you as the manufacturer have to be extremely sure of what you're actually placing on the product, and that your descriptions within your instructions for use are correct. In answer to your question directly though, Dominic, what I would do is to, right at the beginning of your process, decide what you want your product to do, and then try and work out through your classifications and your risk how you would demonstrate that. Try not to deviate from that ideal that you want your product to meet at the end of the day. Sometimes it's very difficult if you start sort of changing or adding additional requirements or additional indications onto your product as you're developing it. So try and focus on what you want to do and aim for that.
Well, that leads on to a very good question that's been raised about the fact that if you're a company that's developing, constantly developing new products or introducing new technology, is the MDR going to hinder some of those innovative companies? Is it going to slow them down in producing new technology, do you think?
It could do, possibly. There was one thing which I didn't mention, though, Helen, and that is that you can always stake equivalence within the company itself. So if I'm a manufacturer, say, of a hip, and I decide that I want to make changes to that hip and I want to do a version 2 of that hip, as the manufacturer of the predicate, I can always claim equivalence to it, because I'm the manufacturer of that, and therefore I would have all of that technical data to support that particular claim. It's just when you're trying to translate that across to a competitor company that it becomes difficult. But there is, I think, particularly for high-risk products, there is a potential that the new regulation in placing additional clinical requirements on could potentially stifle some innovation. We have to also be acutely aware, I think, that with devices you are demonstrating performance as opposed to efficacy. So in many respects we are using the ability to collect post-marketing surveillance and that sort of experience of the product once it's on the market as a real adjunct to your initial clinical work. So you're constantly updating that risk-benefit ratio. It would be unfair, really, for a competent authority to actually ask you to conduct a clinical investigation on a hip which might have a lifetime of 10 years. Nobody in their right mind is going to do a clinical investigation for 10 years. But there are ways of doing that through things like registries or post-marketing work which can constantly update that sort of risk-benefit. So yes, there is a potential for stifling innovation, but it's something which we just have to be aware of, and we just have to sort of be cognizant of.
And I think that's a good point, because it also leads on to a question that's been asked about custom-made devices. Does the move to the MDR impact on specifically on custom-made products?
No, the custom-made device area still exists within MDR, so you will still have the ability to work with custom-made products. There may be some sort of classification issues which you would need to check, but essentially if you have custom-made, then you can still work with custom-made. There is some strengthening in the sort of area of hospital exemptions and how a hospital might work with products, or how a hospital might maintain and change a product once it's been placed on the market. And there you would have the onus of manufacturing transferred to the hospital, perhaps. So there is some discussion on how that should be managed, but essentially custom-made is almost unchanged.
That's really useful to know. Thanks, Phil. We've had quite an important question, I think, in terms of, and this is not something you've covered in the presentation, and probably we need a whole another presentation to talk about it. But how does the new MDR compare with the FDA, for example, the American standard for medical devices? I mean, in a nutshell, are there many significant differences, or are these going to be things that people are going to have to look out for?
That's a really tremendous question, and that's one which you really have to get a crystal ball out for, Helen. At the moment, the regulations are very different. The way that the liabilities lie, even just from that sort of fundamental area. So in my slides and in my presentation, I mentioned that The liability is with us as manufacturers as to when we comply with the regulation in order to place CE mark on the product. In the US, in the same way that you have product licenses granted here, it's the FDA who tell you whether or not you can market your product or not. So again, the FDA is much larger than the competent authorities over here. So that's one way. It's a lot more litigious as a result. But one thing that we are noticing in my expertise is not with FDA, but one thing that is really, really interesting is that we are noticing that a number of manufacturers, or more than a number actually, are suggesting that it's easier. It always used to be easier to place products on the market in Europe than it was in the US, particularly novel and new products. So Europe was used as a base for new product introductions. With the coming of the MDR and the requirements that are now in place for, as you were talking about earlier on, about stifling innovation, the fact that the hurdles have been raised with the MDR, quite rightly in some areas, of course, it means that the market entry requirements are becoming a lot less in the US in comparison with Europe. So many companies are now thinking of using the US as a launch base for their new technologies. And importantly, again, if I was to get my crystal ball out, the US as being part of the International Medical Device Regulators Forum, as are Europe, Japan, Canada, Brazil, a number of other countries, South Korea, Australia, New Zealand. They think along the lines of these essential principles and conformity assessment and standards in the same way that we do here in Europe. So in some ways, the US systems are becoming almost more Europeanized. One particular example of that is in conformity assessment, where the US used to base a lot of their manufacturing compliance on things that were enshrined within their codes of federal regulations, which were obviously mandated by law. And now there's much more of an alignment with programs such as the MDSAP, or the Medical Device Single Audit Program, which is really focused on quality system standards such as 13485. So my guess is that the US is beginning to become more accessible because it's beginning to think along the lines of the new approach, or sort of thinking about how technologies can be introduced in a little bit more streamlined way, whilst Europe, on the other hand, are beginning to sort of think, well, okay, we've really got to try and beef up our regulations. So there is going to be a really interesting point soon where that crossover is gonna reach, as to whether or not you go to the US or Europe. So very, very interesting question.
Yeah, definitely. And something that I guess most manufacturers are having to deal with on a daily basis to try and understand the differences and the similarities between these two regulatory systems. I have a bit of a question for you, actually, Phil, if I might. Digital health, obviously. Right. From an institution point of view, we're the institution of mechanical engineers, but we often spend a lot of time dealing with the electrical side and the software side. How much detail has the MDR picked up in terms of the digital application of technology, or are we looking to that there will be more standards pertaining to digital in the future?
Blimey, I'll tell you what, I'm having some really good questions today. This is tremendous. So in many ways, Helen, we're still looking at round pegs and square holes. The MDR does, of course, talk about standalone software, and standalone software is considered as an active medical device. So you would need to, again, follow through the MDR in order to CE mark products such as standalone software. And of course then there's software which is embedded within devices in order to make them work. So there's two different ways of considering software in that. But then of course we've got all of the new stuff which is coming along, things like artificial intelligence or machine learning, I think, as we'd prefer to call it, machine learning stuff, data mining, looking at data as a prelude, if you like, to actually designing and developing medical technologies. So in the very, very first instance, what you would need to do when you're looking at digital health or digital products is to first of all decide whether that product is actually within scope of the regulation. Excuse me. In some cases, you could argue that a digital technology is not performing any of those requirements within the scope of the regulation. So that's the very first thing to sort of think of. In Europe, and we're thinking particularly in the UK as we leave, and we didn't mention Brexit at all, but as we leave Europe, this is potentially one area where we're looking at in the UK particularly at how we can have some smart thinking around regulation. And if you think about even the development times of products, a pharmaceutical product might take 10 to 12 years to get to the market, whereas a medical device might take 18 months to 2 years, and a digital product might take 6 months. So it's very difficult to have a set of regulations which will be that reactive to new technologies. So what we're actually sort of thinking of in those sorts of areas is whether or not we should be looking at those sorts of self-learning or different machine learning type applications, whether or not they should be covered by different auspices within the Department of Health. Perhaps there are groups within the CQC which deal with processes within the NHS, might be better to monitor and ensure safety of use of those sorts of processes rather than the MHRA. But these are very, very fledgling thoughts, and thoughts which have yet to be developed. And for sure, the US have developed those thoughts a lot faster than we have, and that sort of adaptive way that regulation works with those technologies is much more and better described within the US systems at the moment, unfortunately. But as I say, that could be one of those things that we'd be working with the FDA as we leave Europe as something which might be more appropriate to the UK market.
Absolutely, Phil. We're coming up to the last couple of minutes, actually, and I guess you've touched on a couple of things there about how the NHS, for example, might deal with devices in the future and the need to separate out some of the different types of technology that we use. And we've had a very good final question, and I think this is a good one to kind of future gaze. Is how do you see the UK standards sort of deviating over time from the CE mark process as we've now, or in the process of leaving the EU? Is that going to be something that's going to affect our industry an awful lot?
Hopefully for the better. If I'm to put my optimist's hat on, always been a glass half full person. To assure people on the end of the phone, you will have noticed in the last couple of weeks we've had the introduction of the UK Medicines and Medical Devices Bill, which has been passed by government. That's basically suggesting that, that in combination with the transition period that we're currently running up to December of this year, before we officially leave with a trade deal, of course, we will be working to European rules, and the rules which come into place during that period between now and December. Now, the end of the transition period for the MDR, as we mentioned before, is the 27th of May of this year. So we will be working with the MDR, whether we like it or not, in December. Okay? So if you place a CE mark on your product, you can place your product onto the UK market. So MDR is not going to go away. What we then have to think about, before I say that, there is a little bit of a discussion as to what would happen with the in vitro diagnostics regulation, of course, because the end of that transition period runs out after December of 2020, and in fact runs out to May 27th, 2022. So the MHRA, although they can't see any reason why they wouldn't be working to the IVDR, there is still that question as to what we would do. But MDR, for sure, we will be working with that after December. Now, how quickly we diverge from that will really depend on the trade deals that we work up with Europe, the mutual recognition agreements that we have with Europe. But for sure, I think that what we should be doing is not necessarily looking at regulatory alignment, but more data compatibility. So that if we're working with a bunch of data which is going to be generating technical files against the MDR, that data should be equally acceptable in other jurisdictions. So, of course, if you're going to be wanting to sell your product in Europe, you're going to have to put a CE mark on it anyway. And in the short term, you're going to have to put a CE mark on it to place the product on the UK market. I don't think that we're going to end up with a UK mark. We might end up with a difference in the way that we register products on the market. But the MHRA has always been one of the leading regulatory authorities and is understood by everybody to be one of the most pragmatic of all agencies. So my guess is that in order to for the UK to remain competitive as far as new innovations and all of that sort of stuff, the MHRA will sort of come up with, or will start to work on a lot more streamlined processes which allow that to happen while still allowing companies to flourish in those other markets, if that sort of makes sense. I'm not sure whether I answered that question particularly well.
I think that's great, Phil. Thank you ever so much. And I think that's a really good point to end on. Everybody who's joined us today, I hope this has been a really useful session for you. Thank you to everyone who's left questions, and those people that have missed out on the opportunity for Phil to answer questions. We will hopefully, he's very kindly offered to answer your questions personally offline, so that's great. Phil, thank you again for taking the time to present today, and thank you everybody for listening to this webinar from the Institution of Mechanical Engineers.